our last Tuesday group, I think, it was mentioned, how does right effort blend with the poem that I read from Gendam Rinpoche? This is a paradox in sitting practice, but first I'm going to read this poem again. And I found a Dharma talk that if we have enough time, I'd like to play as much of it as I can, because she addresses a little more of the what right effort is all about. I mean, there's volumes on the Eightfold Path. And right effort is along the way. The first three, maybe I'll find let me see if I can find the shared screen I like to do just as a reminder, and it'll be informational for the Eightfold Path. So here it is. In the Eightfold Path, there are three segments. The segment of Panya, or wisdom, which is wise understanding or right view, skillful view, which is understanding the Four Noble Truths that suffering exists and it happens because of clinging and craving. And if we are willing to let go of our clinging and craving, there's a path to take us there. And this Eightfold Path has wise understanding the Four Noble Truths. There's wise intention, the intention of setting out on the path, the intention that we sometimes have when we sit, of being mindful before our sitting practice. Those two are in the wisdom category. And then there's three categories of harmonious living or ethical behavior. There's wise speech, there's right action, and there's wise or skillful livelihood. Those are within, how we get along with each other in speaking truthfully, kindly, if it's necessary. The wise action is knowing when is the right time for action. And there's wise livelihood. And then in the samadhi training, which is the training of the mind, we have wise effort in there. It's not back here in sila, in harmonious living, but it's considered part of how we calm and train the mind. So there's wise effort, then there's wise mindfulness, and then there's wise concentration. And so when we, let me see, did it unshare? I think it did, right? So when we think about right effort, there's a certain amount needed to stay awake and aware of what's happening. And yet the paradox of letting go and not be attached and not, identifying with or passing judgment on whatever arises in the mind or what we think we might want to accomplish in the mind. We have to let go of striving. But there's a certain amount of effort, and you've heard me use this analogy before around, well, actually, I think I'm going to save it because I think she talks about it in her Dharma talk that I'm going to play, and she gives a longer version of the person who needs to have the strings on their lute tuned just right in order to have music come from the strings. Can't be too loose, can't be too tight. So even though we open and relax and create space, and we don't search to try to accomplish something, because it's already resting right here quietly within us, and there isn't anything to do or to force. Everything happens by itself, but we have enough effort to be interested and aware of actually what is happening, and to notice that, as we find out very quickly in our practice, a lot of a lot of what goes on is affected by the hindrances. We quite often find ourselves lost in sloth and torpor, or doubt, or restlessness, or grasping. And so those 5 hindrances, and then the other things that are, it's a longer list, it's called the 10 fetters. But these are ways that we need to apply enough effort to not be lost in those. And it's also helpful to have the mind inclined toward skillful thinking. So also included here in right effort is the another list, but it's the 7 factors of enlightenment. And these 7 factors are a way that we can incline the mind toward skillful when we incline the mind away from the unskillful. So the 7 factors of enlightenment, if I say them, you'll know because they're always in your practice somewhere. There's mindfulness, there's investigation, there's energy, there it is. There's joy, piti, the joy of the practice. And then that joy can turn into tranquility, a much calmer, more subtle kind of happiness. And from that tranquility, which is there in those last 3 steps, it's concentration. Through that tranquility comes concentration and then equanimity. So we can be sitting in our practice and we have enough understanding over time that there are hindrances that are there. We can do the practice of the breath or the practices of loving kindness, and we can see the hindrances but not fall into them. We can acknowledge them, but we are continuing on the factors of awakening, of having enough energy and joy, noticing tranquility and that calmness of the mind without flowing off into everything we're thinking about, or whatever restlessness is arising or doubt that might be arising. We turn ourselves back to that single object of the breath for concentration, and then equanimity falls naturally from it. So we have both the hindrances and the factors of enlightenment as part of this conversation on right effort. So let me see if I can find what I wanted to share with you. There are many talks on Dharma seed by all kinds of different people on skillful effort. But this person, Deborah Ratner Helzer, she has practiced with Western and with Asian teachers in the Theravadan tradition since 1995. And she was included in that she was a year as a nun in Burma. And she's been teaching in the Washington, D.C. area. And she helps with retreats all around the country since like 2001. And this was from a recent talk at Insight Meditation Center at the Retreat Center, where she and Mark Nunberg were doing a retreat on, I believe it was compassion and mindfulness. I can't quite remember what it was called. But I'm going to look for it in my iTunes library, then I'm going to ask you if you can hear it. So make yourselves comfortable and continue listening, whether you need to stand up or stay seated. Let the mind stay open, and let's see where she takes us. Let's see how this goes.
You can think of insight as the process of opening a door in the mind.
Can you hear it?
Not that psychedelic.
Is it the right volume?
You have to go to a different retreat for that.
I better back up so you can hear her joke. Okay, here we go.
We can think of insight as the process of opening a door in the mind. Not that psychedelic one. You have to go to a different retreat for that. but the Dharma door, what we sometimes call the Dharma eye, which leads from our familiar realm of delusion, confusion, suffering, into maybe a less familiar realm of wisdom, compassion, equanimity. And unfortunately, there's not yet a passcode that we can give you for that door. So we each have to do the work, as we've been saying, of opening that door for ourselves. We each have to solve our own problem in this arena. But if we think about the process of getting through a locked door, like maybe the ones on our rooms here, what do we have to do? Well, we have to unlock the door with the key. We have to unlatch the door by turning the knob, and then we have to push. And we have to do all three of those things in the right order, in the right way, in order to actually get through the door. So we can put the key in the lock and turn it, unlock it, and then, but if we don't also turn the handle and push, we're going to be standing in front of that door for a very long time, waiting for it to open. Or if we push and push and push on the door until we're blue in the face, if we haven't unlocked it, it's also going to be quite some time before we get into the room. So the door of the Dharma is also like this. We need a variety of tools that we need to use in harmony, in concert, in order to actually get through to the room of insight, of wisdom, of compassion. And traditionally it's said in the teaching on the Eightfold Path, as the meditative portion of the path, that we need 3 ingredients to get through the wisdom door, get through the Dharma door. Which of course we need all of the Eightfold Path. That's why there's 8 folds, 8 spokes to it. So we also need the portion of the path that has to do with correct understanding. We need to know what we're doing here. We have to understand enough of the teachings to actually get here, to take up the work. And then we also need to be living our lives in a way that's in harmony with our overall aspiration. So our work and our practice outside of here has to be in harmony with what we're doing here, or it's going to be very difficult to launch it, to launch the inner work, the bhavana work. So we need the support of all the portions of the Eightfold Path. But once we begin to sit down, once we get on the cushion or stand up or go to our walking place with the intention to really start to discover the truth for ourselves, then it's these meditative factors that become foremost that we're working on developing. And those are skillful effort and skillful mindfulness and skillful concentration. Effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Those are the main factors that we're mobilizing and cultivating through the meditative portion of our path. And just as with the door and the key and the handle, they have to be applied in the right way, skillfully, in order for them to be effective. So the role of right effort is to quiet down those states of mind and body that make it difficult to settle in the present moment, make it difficult to pick up on what's going on in the present moment, that hinder us from connecting with the present moment, which we usually call the hindrances. You might also hear the terms defilements or some other terms that are more severe. So it's difficult to notice what's happening in the present moment when we're in the grip of a lot of lethargy, a lot of restlessness, as you've no doubt had the chance to observe very keenly for yourselves. Or when we're in the grip of a lot of obsessive thinking, also probably an experience you've had, caught up in craving, caught up in aversion, caught up in doubt, wonder, confusion, then it's hard to settle. It's hard to settle into contact with the present moment, with the present moment's reality. Not impossible, but harder. So they're called hindrances, not roadblocks. So the role of right mindfulness then is to notice what's happening in the present moment once we do come into contact with it, to remind us to notice, to be aware of what's going on in the mind and body. And the role of skillful concentration is to help to make our awareness clearer, help to make it stronger, more penetrating, so that we can gradually see more and more deeply. What are the deeper truths of the present moment? Where is that insight that we're seeking? So concentration in itself without sufficient mindfulness is not going to get us through the door. Also mindfulness without sufficient concentration is not going to get us through the door. And if we're not applying this kind of steady, balanced effort that we keep talking about, then we're just not really going to get anywhere. And they say sufficient here, sufficient mindfulness, sufficient concentration, because really it's impossible to develop either of those in isolation. So in order to be mindful, there has to be enough concentration to focus on what we're being mindful of. And in order to concentrate, we need enough mindfulness to connect with whatever it is we're trying to concentrate on. So really, they don't develop independently. They're very interwoven. Bhante Gunaratana, affectionately known as Bhante G, the author of Mindfulness in Plain English, if you've read it, this classic of this style of practice, of insight practice, he ends every meditation session that he leads with this little catchphrase, which is, there is no concentration without wisdom, no wisdom without concentration. One who has both concentration and wisdom is close to peace and emancipation. It's a nice little one-verse Dharma talk that pretty much says it all. Gets right at the heart of this practice of what we're doing, developing this partnership between the clear seeing that comes with mindfulness, which when applied with effort and concentration will take us through that door of insight to greater peace and greater happiness. The commentaries have a kind of poetic metaphor for this relationship that goes like this. It says, suppose 3 children go to a park to play. While walking along, they see a tree with flowering tops and decide they want to gather some flowers. But the flowers are beyond the reach of even the tallest child. So one of the friends gets down on their hands and knees and offers their back to serve as a step stool. Then the tallest child climbs up, but they're not very stable in that position on their friend's back. So they're hesitant to actually reach their arm out and pluck the flower. So then the third child comes over and stands next to them and offers their shoulder for support to steady the tall child. So then the tall child, standing on the back of their friend and steadied by their other friend, can finally reach up and gather the flowers. This metaphor always makes me think of the giant native magnolia trees that we have in the area where I live around Washington, D.C., and especially where some of my family's from down in Virginia. They're these big, beautiful evergreen trees with these gigantic leaves and really big flowers, kind of the size of dinner plates to put out. If you've ever been around one of these magnolia trees, it's just this amazing scent when they're blooming that really permeates the whole vicinity. But they tend to be up high in the tree. So usually, when you're a child walking underneath them, the only way that you really know they're there is you can smell them. They smell great. So I do have memories of a child as going through various machinations like this with my friends, trying to get up and get at and pluck these magnificent flowers. And with some teamwork, we could sometimes pull it off. This is a teaching related to skillful effort that I've always loved, the imagery of this. On one occasion, a certain deva of stunning beauty appeared before the Buddha, illuminating all around them. They paid homage to the Buddha, stood to one side, and said, "Tell me, Venerable One, how you crossed over the flood." To which the Buddha replied, "By not stopping and by not struggling, friend, I crossed over the flood." "But how is it," asked the deva, "that by not stopping and not struggling, you were able to cross over the flood?" The Buddha said, "When I stopped, I sank, but when I struggled, I was spun about. In this way, friend, by not stopping and not struggling, I crossed the flood." To which the deva replied, "At long last, I see a being who is fully unbound. who by not stopping and not struggling has crossed over the entanglements of the world. Then, after paying homage again to the Buddha, the Deva vanished right there and then. So not struggling and not stopping. And that also in itself is the whole Dharma teaching. Not struggling and not stopping. That's a phrase I use to encourage myself a lot when I am struggling or am stopping. Kind of a modern commentary on this that comes from my own life is the experience of watching my children learn how to swim. So each of my children is on a different side of that line right now. So my younger one is just in the process of learning how to swim, taking his first swim classes. And, he loves when an adult will get in the pool with him and hold him up and kind of float him around, where he doesn't have to do anything. He's just going to free ride, But if you take that hand away, he sinks like a stone still. Or if you tell him, okay, now you learned in class how to move your arms, how to kick your legs, go for it. Then there's a lot of like crazy flailing and, again, not so effective. Whereas my daughter, who's a little bit older, has become quite a proficient swimmer at this point. She's not Katie Ledecky, but she can kind of, if she were to, God forbid, fall off a pier or something, she can get herself to the edge of the water, we hope, just by doing kind of a basic, competent front crawl. She's water safe now. So she's learned how to apply that kind of steady, just steady, solid, purposeful effort to get across the water. So, not all of us are going to be world-class swimmers, and not all of us are going to be world-class meditators. Not all of us are going to be the Katie Ledecky meditators of the world. Some of us will be, and thank goodness for that, right? Because we need people to guide us. But for most of us, just being able to do kind of a basic, competent front crawl is actually enough. That's good enough, but I also take great comfort in that. But, finding that particular quantity and quality of effort that's going to be effective for the practice can take some time. It takes some trial and error. I remember seeing a great cartoon. There was also great teaching years ago when I first started practice. It's like one of those ones where the guy's climbing up the mountain to get to the teacher, and he gets up to the guru on the top of the mountain. He says, "Tell me the secret of happiness." And the guru says, "Good judgment." And then he says, "How do I learn good judgment?" And the teacher says, "Bad judgment." This is applicable to so many things, right? But to our Dharma practice as well. Unfortunately, we tend to need to find out or to find where that balance of effort is through quite a bit of trial and error, and often repeatedly. So we may find it and then kind of lose it, and things change, and we find it again and we lose it again, and kind of like that. The distinguishing characteristic of skillful effort is that it's purposeful. This is always how it's described in the texts, in the old texts, in the traditional teachings. So it's not described particularly in the quality of the effort directly, but in the purpose of the effort and what it accomplishes, which I find that interesting. So the Buddha makes it very clear that skillful effort is that kind of effort that we can apply to create a wholesome environment in the mind, a wholesome environment in the mind. And the Buddha spelled this out in his typically very clear and thorough style. So he said, if there's nothing unwholesome in the mind, nothing particularly unwholesome in the mind at any particular moment, apply effort such that nothing unwholesome arises. If there is something unwholesome in the mind, then apply effort such that it will either move along or transform into something wholesome. If there's nothing wholesome in the mind, nothing particularly, good going on in the mind, then invite it in, arouse it, apply effort to try to cultivate something wholesome. And if there is something wholesome in the mind already, then nurture it, try to sustain it, try to cultivate it. So that kind of covers all the fronts, right? It covers all the bases. He was very thorough. But how do we actually go about doing this? So if there's nothing unwholesome in the mind, how do we keep it from entering in? And not too surprisingly, the answer that he gave was mindfulness. Through mindfulness. Mindfulness has this protective quality that we've talked about. We've talked about guarding the sense doors. So when we're remembering to be present, when we're remembering to be in the present moment, that it's much harder for things to slip past the radar, right? It's much harder for those unwholesome thoughts, feelings to take hold because we're on the lookout for them. If they do arise, then they arise in a space of mindfulness. And as soon as mindfulness is present, the environment in the mind is wholesome, believe it or not. It's much better to have something unwholesome going on in the mind and know it than to not know it. It's those moments of unconscious, unwholesome thoughts and feelings that are conditioning more of those moments and also driving us to act them out in ways that may be harmful. So it's much more painful, but much healthier to actually see the unwholesome things going on in our mind. There's this question that came up this morning about noticing that something wasn't happening. So there may be times when we may become aware, especially if there's been a lot of unwholesome things coming up in the mind. We may have some period sitting, walking, doing whatever, where we notice, hey, that's not going on. All that reactivity that I was having in that last sitting, it's not here anymore. So it's really important to notice that. So this is part of the instructions the Buddha gave for this practice. Notice when there's not something unwholesome going on, because that helps us to get familiar with what that feels like and to cultivate that quality, that environment of mind. If we don't notice it, then we can't cultivate it. So pay attention, keep an eye out for those times when something that's been really, afflicting us is just not there. We can notice that too. If there is something unwholesome going on in the mind, then skillful effort will clear it out, move it along, or transform our relationship to it. And this is where most of us feel like we're doing most of our work in the early days of the retreat, in the early days, years, decades of our practice, is working with the unwholesome things that are there, that we notice. And what the heck do we do with them? But you guys already know the answer to that, right? Mindfulness. Yeah. If this was a multiple choice test, I think you all would do pretty well on it. So we see a lot how that works, right? Or hopefully as the days of the retreat go on, as we move along in our practice, we see more and more how that works. How there, as I was just saying, there really is a different climate in the mind when there's awareness of what's happening. And things may not change in the way that we want them to, but there's different things happening when we see the unwholesomeness that's going on in the mind. There's learning that can happen. There's growth that can happen out of that, believe it or not. Mindfulness is kind of like the philosopher's stone, in ancient mythology that was said to be able to turn base metals into gold. So that obsessive thought, that unrelenting pain, the tedious boredom, whatever it is that is driving us crazy, if we can greet it as a teacher and bow to it and see what it has to tell us, then it can be a source of liberation. It can be a source of awakening and insight. So with skillful effort, we learn to transform that relationship, how we're relating to the difficult things that come up, which obviously takes a lot of practice. Then we have the case where there isn't anything wholesome in the mind. So invite it in. And there's various ways to do this. The loving kindness practice that we're doing is actually one of the traditional ways of doing this. That's one of the reasons that we offer that practice. There's a whole variety of practices like that, of wholesome reflections on the loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, sympathetic joy, reflections on the virtues of the teachings, reflections on all sorts of things. The Buddha actually encouraged us to use our thinking mind in a skillful way to actually promote a wholesome environment in the mind. Much better to be, sitting and reading the metta chant on our sheet than to be sitting and going over our to-do list for the 200th time. It is better to have wholesome thoughts injected in there, and we have a choice about that. We can do that. But for the purposes of this retreat, the way in which we invite in wholesome states is mindfulness, right? So just through that power of mindfulness, mindfulness is said to kind of come with a whole posse of wholesome friends. That when mindfulness is present in the mind, it's much easier for all of the other wholesome qualities of mind to come in. Patience, resolve, kindness, just a whole troop of them. And you may start to notice this as mindfulness gets stronger. There starts to be other wholesome qualities there as well. So just simply through the power of mindfulness, we're house cleaning. It clears out the mind. It's said to be a purification process. We're clearing out the circuits. And then we have the case where if something wholesome is already present in the mind and we notice it, then to really nurture it and sustain it. And more as the days of the retreat go on, you might actually begin to notice more wholesome mental states, more wholesome things happening in the mind. So it's important to notice these because the way in which we cultivate and encourage wholesome mental states is mindfulness. Again, if we don't see them, then we can't nurture them, but the more that we notice, oh, hey, there was a moment of calm. There was a moment of clarity. There was a moment of genuine compassion, or whatever it is. The more we notice those moments, that actually strengthens them because we're becoming familiar with what those states feel like, and that reinforces them. It creates this positive feedback loop. When we're only noticing the unpleasant, painful, negative things that are coming up in the mind, then that's where we're giving all our attention. There's not a chance for the wholesome things to take root as much. So we really have to keep an eye out for keeping our attention balanced, because what can happen is we pay a lot of attention while the big storms are going on, while there's all the pain in the body, all the turmoil in the mind. And then when things get a little easier, when the wholesome factors actually get stronger, then, it's like we just kind of sit back and space out or chill out or whatever until things get hard again, which is natural. That's a natural dynamic when we first start. And many of you are actually reporting on this, that they're starting to be more calm. It's so funny, our relationship to calm. This is a particularly helpful one to start to notice during the retreat, because for most of us, we will get calmer while we're here. But when calm first starts arising, very often it feels like there's a void. It feels like there's nothing happening, right? Things just kind of get quiet and there's not a lot going on, and there can be this feeling of, okay, this is boring. or there can actually be a feeling of what's wrong. Why is nothing happening? Am I doing something wrong? Do I need to manufacture something or look for something? Some of us might actually be quite freaked out by calm because it's such an alien experience. So at the time when it seems like things are settling down and there's not so much of a storm going on, have a look around, survey the mental terrain. Maybe there's calm, maybe there's some equanimity, maybe there's some joy, maybe there's some peace. We have to, at a certain point, bring all of those wholesome qualities into our awareness. And that's how they strengthen, so that there starts to be a landmark on our mental map that's calm. There starts to be a landmark on our mental map that's equanimity. And that's how they grow and get stronger. Those start to be part of what's on the menu as we get more familiar with them. If we don't see them, we can't add them to the menu. So basically, skillful effort is the effort that we make to be mindful, which accomplishes all four of these tasks that the Buddha set in relation to skillful effort. The effort to be mindful clears the field for clear seeing and insight. And it quiets down the hindrances, not completely at first, but a little bit, enough so that there start to be some spaces to connect more fully with the present moment, to experience the present moment more fully without so much hindering, without so much interference. The Buddha said, cultivate the good. It is possible. If it were not possible, I would not ask. So cultivate what is good. Abandon the unwholesome. It is possible. If it were not possible, I would not ask. So abandon the unwholesome. I just love how practical these teachings are, and this voice of the Buddha that comes through. He's so pragmatic. He solved his problem. He found deep peace, and he went on to teach it. But he says, if it weren't possible for you too, I wouldn't ask you to do it. I wouldn't bother. But it is possible. So have a go at it.
That seems like a good place to stop for now. It's a longer talk. There's another half an hour to it, but I want us to have some time to just sit for a few minutes again and let those words settle down. I'll ring the bell once and then I'll ring it once again in like 5 minutes. Letting those words settle, and just giving ourselves a gentle reminder that it's a good practice to recollect the factors of enlightenment or any other wholesome state and become familiar with them. And in this way, we can recognize them when they arise and cultivate their growth. Recognizing these beautiful mind factors in ourselves strengthens our confidence and inspires us for further skillful effort. And it puts us on a path toward awakening. We have a tendency to be so hard on ourselves and only notice the uncomfortable things that we aren't doing right or whatever, that it's always good to incline the mind toward the wholesome and remembering some of these places that can bring joy with just the right amount of effort. So with all that being said, I'm just going to put in the chat the reminder about that the teachings are offered freely, and the donation if you feel like it. There's the practice of generosity, of dana, that brings great gratitude. And there isn't any obligation. We just like to continue supporting the teachers and those who offer the Dhamma. And so right there is one of my favorite quotes that you've heard me give before. This is one of them. By giving this gift, my heart will be glad and happiness and joy will arise in me. One gives because it ennobles and adorns the mind. And adorning the mind in this case has to do with bringing joy and bringing kindness. And we have our own little Dana basket there for the first and second Sundays of the month. And so if you feel like it, go to it. But otherwise, let's have some